James Mitchell stood very still outside the big palace gates. His red uniform was clean and bright in the morning sun. He held his black hat under his arm and kept his back straight. James was 34 years old and had been a royal guard for 12 years. The palace behind him was huge and white. It had many windows that sparkled in the light. This was Buckingham Palace, where the Queen lived. James felt proud every time he looked at it. He was one of the special soldiers who kept the Queen safe. Every morning, James put on his red coat and black pants. He polished his big black boots until they shined like mirrors. He brushed his tall black hat and made sure it sat perfectly on his head. His rifle was clean and ready. Everything had to be perfect when you worked for the Queen. James loved his job. He had wanted to be a royal guard since he was a little boy. His father had been a soldier too. His grandfather had served the royal family. It was in his blood, his mother always said. The morning air was cool and fresh. Birds sang in the trees around the palace. James could smell flowers from the palace gardens. It was going to be a beautiful day in London. People were already walking around the palace. Some carried cameras. Others had bags and maps. They came from all over the world to see the famous guards. James knew they would take pictures of him. They always did. The tourists liked to watch the guards because they never moved. They stood like statues for hours. They did not smile or wave. They did not talk to anyone. This was their job. This was what made them special. James had learned how to stand very still for a long time. At first it was hard. His feet would hurt. His back would get tired. But now he could do it easily. He could stand for 2 hours without moving at all. Sometimes children would try to make him laugh. They would make funny faces or tell jokes. James never reacted. Sometimes people would ask him questions. He never answered. Some tourists got angry when he did not respond. But James knew the rules. A royal guard never breaks his position. James thought about his family while he stood guard. His wife Sarah was probably making breakfast for their 2 children. Tommy was 8 years old and loved football. Little Emma was 5 and liked to draw pictures. James missed them when he worked, but he knew he was doing important work. The other guards stood at their posts too. James could see Robert at the next gate. Robert was his best friend. They had trained together and served together for many years. Robert had 2 children too. They often talked about their families when they were off duty. James remembered his first day as a royal guard. He was so nervous. His hand shook as he put on his uniform. His commanding officer told him that being a royal guard was the greatest honor a soldier could have. James believed this with all his heart. The training had been very hard. They learned how to march in perfect lines. They practiced standing still for hours. They studied the history of the royal family. They learned about weapons and safety. Only the best soldiers became royal guards. James was good at his job. His officers praised him for his discipline. He had never been late. He had never broken the rules. His uniform was always perfect. His weapon was always clean. He was proud of his record. The tourists were getting closer now. James could hear them talking in different languages. Some spoke English with strange accents. Others spoke languages he did not understand. But they all wanted the same thing, to see the famous guards who protected the Queen. A group of school children walked by with their teacher. They pointed at James and whispered to each other. One little girl waved at him. James wanted to wave back, but he could not move. The rules were clear. No moving, no talking, no reactions. James thought about why the rules existed. The royal guards were symbols. They represented the strength and dignity of Britain. People from around the world came to see them. If they moved or talked, they would just be regular soldiers. But by staying perfectly still, they became something special. The sun was getting higher in the sky. James could feel its warmth on his face. His uniform was getting a little hot, but he did not mind. He was used to standing in all kinds of weather. Rain, snow, wind, heat. Nothing stopped a royal guard from doing his duty. James looked at his watch without moving his head. It was almost 10 o'clock. In 2 hours, another guard would come to replace him. Then he could go home and see his family. Sarah always had lunch ready for him. The children would tell him about their morning at school. More tourists gathered around the palace gates. James could see cameras pointing at him. He knew his picture would be in photo albums all over the world. People would show their friends and say, "Look, this is one of the Queen's guards." This made James feel important. A tour guide was telling a group about the palace. James listened as the man explained the history of the royal guards. The guide said the guards were the best soldiers in Britain. He said they were chosen for their courage and discipline. James felt proud to hear this. The morning was peaceful and quiet. James felt calm and focused. This was what he was born to do. Standing guard at the palace was not just a job, it was his calling. He protected the Queen and represented his country. There was no greater honor. James had no idea that in just a few minutes everything would change. He did not know that this perfect morning would be the last normal moment of his career. He stood tall and proud, completely unaware that his life was about to be turned upside down. The clock tower in the distance began to chime 10 o'clock. James had been standing at his post for exactly 2 hours. His replacement would arrive soon. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. But sometimes life changes in an instant and nothing is ever the same again. The scream cut through the morning air like a knife. James had been standing perfectly still watching the tourists walk around the palace. Then suddenly a woman's voice rang out across the street. It was not a normal shout. It was a scream of pure terror. James could not turn his head, but he could see from the corner of his eye. Something was happening near the big white monument across the street. The Victoria Memorial stood there like a beautiful cake made of stone. Tourists always took pictures there. But now something was very wrong. The woman screamed again. This time James could hear words. "Help! Someone help my boy!" "Please help!" Her voice was breaking with fear. James felt his heart start to beat faster. Every part of him wanted to look, but he could not move. More people started shouting. James could see tourists running toward the monument. They were pointing and calling out. Some people had their phones out, probably calling for help. But James could not see what was happening. The rules said he must keep looking straight ahead. The woman kept screaming. "He can't breathe!" "He can't breathe. Someone help us." Now James could hear the panic in her voice. A child was in trouble. A mother was terrified. And James could only stand there and listen. James tried to use his side vision to see better. He could make out shapes moving near the monument. There was a crowd forming. People were bending down, looking at something on the ground. The woman's voice was getting higher and more desperate. "Please, anyone, help my little boy," she cried. James could hear she was crying now. Her words came between sobs. "He just fell down. He can't breathe. Where is the ambulance?" James felt sweat on his forehead. His hands wanted to shake, but he kept them steady. His training told him to stay still. His duty was to guard the palace, but his heart was telling him something else. A child needed help, and he was just standing there. Other guards heard the screaming, too. James could see Robert at the next post. Robert's eyes looked worried, but he did not move either. None of the guards moved. They all knew the rules. They all knew what would happen if they left their posts. The crowd across the street was getting bigger. James could hear men's voices now, too. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. "Does anyone know first aid?" called another. "Give him space," said a third voice. But the mother kept screaming for help. James had been trained in first aid. All soldiers learned how to help hurt people. He had saved lives during his time in the army before becoming a royal guard. He knew how to help people who could not breathe. He knew what to do in emergencies. But he was not allowed to move. The woman's voice was getting weaker now. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. "Please don't die, baby. Please don't leave, Mommy. Someone help us." James felt tears in his own eyes. This was someone's child. Someone's little boy was dying and nobody knew what to do. James looked at the tourists near him. They were all watching the scene across the street. Some were taking pictures with their phones. Others just stood there looking scared. A few people tried to cross the street to help, but they seemed confused and frightened. "Where is the ambulance?" the woman screamed. "Why is it taking so long?" James knew that ambulances in London were usually fast. But sometimes traffic was bad. Sometimes they got lost. Sometimes they were helping other people first. And sometimes a few minutes could mean the difference between life and death. The child's mother was begging now. "Please, God, help my baby. Please don't take him from me." James could hear the love and fear in her voice. He thought about his own children. What if Tommy or Emma was lying on the ground, unable to breathe? What if Sarah was screaming for help while strangers just watched? James tried to see better without moving his head. The crowd was thick now, but he could make out a small figure on the ground. It was a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The same age as Tommy. The child was not moving. His mother was on her knees beside him, touching his face and crying. Some tourists were trying to help, but they did not know what to do. James could hear them talking. Should we move him? I don't know CPR. Where did you learn that? I'm not a doctor. They meant well, but they were making things worse by crowding around. The mother looked up at the crowd. Please, someone must know what to do. He has asthma. He can't breathe. Please help my son. James knew about asthma. He had learned about it in his medical training. Without the right help, people with asthma could die very quickly. James felt his body wanting to move. His legs wanted to run. His hands wanted to help. His heart was beating so fast he thought everyone could hear it. But his training held him in place. 12 years of discipline kept his feet planted on the ground. A man in the crowd was trying to help. I think I know CPR, he said. But the woman shook her head. No, don't touch him. You might hurt him. She was so scared she did not know what to do. James wanted to tell her that the man was trying to help, but he could not speak. The little boy's lips were turning blue. James could see this even from far away. Blue lips meant the child was not getting enough air. Blue lips meant time was running out. James had seen this before in the army. He knew what it meant. More people came running from different directions, but they were all just regular people. Tourists and shoppers and office workers. None of them were doctors or nurses. None of them knew what to do for a child who could not breathe. The woman looked around desperately. Her eyes found the royal guards across the street. For a moment, she looked right at James. Help us, she called to the guards. Please, you're soldiers. You must know first aid. Help my boy. James felt his heart break. The woman was looking at him with such hope. She thought he could save her child. She thought he would help. But James could not move. The rules were clear. A royal guard never leaves his post. Never. Not for any reason. The child's breathing was getting worse. Even from across the street, James could see the boy's chest moving wrong. Short, quick breaths that did not give him enough air. The clock was ticking. Every second mattered, and James stood frozen watching a child die. 30 seconds felt like 30 hours. James stood frozen while the little boy fought for his life across the street. The mother's screams filled the air. The crowd of tourists stood around helplessly, and James counted every heartbeat, knowing that each one might be the child's last. The boy was getting worse. James could see it clearly now. The child's small body was fighting for air that would not come. His chest moved up and down too fast like a bird with a broken wing. His skin was turning pale. His lips were blue like winter ice. James had seen this before during his army days. He knew the signs of a severe asthma attack. The airways close up tight. The lungs cannot get air. Without help, the person dies. It is that simple. And this little boy was dying right in front of him. The mother was crying so hard she could barely breathe herself. Baby, stay with mommy, she whispered to her son. Don't go to sleep. Keep your eyes open. Help is coming. But her voice shook with fear. She knew her child was slipping away. James thought about his own son, Tommy. What if Tommy was lying there? What if Sarah was the one crying and begging for help? James would want someone to save his child. Any father would. Any human being would. But James was not just any human being. He was a royal guard. He had taken an oath to protect the Queen and follow orders. He had promised to never leave his post. Breaking that promise meant losing everything he had worked for. Everything he was. The rules were burned into his mind from 12 years of service. A guard never abandons his position. Duty comes before everything else. The monarchy depends on your discipline. These words had been repeated thousands of times during training. James remembered his commanding officer's words from his first day. You are not just a soldier anymore. You are a symbol. The whole world watches you. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and you destroy the honor of every guard who came before you. But the little boy was dying. James could see it happening. The child's breathing was getting slower and weaker. His mother's cries were getting more desperate. Please don't leave me, she begged her son. Mommy needs you. Daddy needs you. Stay with us, baby. James looked at the other guards. They all stood perfectly still like statues. Their faces showed no emotion. They followed the rules. They did their duty. They did not move, no matter what happened around them. Robert stood at his post 20 feet away. James could see his friend's eyes. They looked sad and worried, but Robert did not move either. He knew the rules, too.
He had a family, too.
He could not risk losing everything for someone else's child. The woman looked at the guards again. "Please," she screamed. "You're soldiers. You know how to save people. My baby is dying. Please help us." Her voice cracked with pain. She was a mother watching her child die, and the only people who might help her were not allowed to move. James felt something break inside his chest. This was not right. Rules were important, but not more important than a child's life. The Queen would understand. The army would understand. Any good person would understand. But James knew they would not understand. The military was not about being good. It was about following orders. The Royal Guard was not about saving people. It was about standing still and looking impressive for tourists. The boy's eyes were starting to close. His breathing was so shallow that James could barely see his chest moving. The mother shook her son gently. "No, baby. Don't close your eyes. Look at Mommy. Stay awake." James made his choice in that moment. It was not really a choice at all. It was the only thing a father and a human being could do. He could not watch a child die when he had the power to help. James moved his right foot first. After 2 hours of standing perfectly still, the movement felt strange. Then his left foot. Then he was walking. Then he was running. His heavy black boots hit the pavement hard. His red coat flew behind him like a cape. His tall hat fell off his head and rolled on the ground. But James did not stop. He ran toward the dying child as fast as he could. Behind him, gasps rose from the crowd of tourists. Cameras flashed and clicked. People pointed and stared. "Look, the guard is moving," someone shouted. "He's running," called another. "I can't believe it," said a third. The other guards stood frozen in shock. In 12 years of service, none of them had ever seen anything like this. Guards did not move. Guards did not run. Guards did not abandon their posts. What James was doing was impossible. James heard the shouts and gasps, but he did not care. All he could think about was the little boy who needed help. The distance felt like miles, but it was only 200 yards. James had run much farther during his training, but he had never run for a reason this important. The crowd around the child saw him coming. They stepped back to make room. The red uniform was easy to spot. Everyone knew what it meant. A royal guard was breaking every rule to help this child. The mother looked up and saw James running toward them. Her eyes went wide with hope and surprise. "You came," she whispered. "You actually came to help us." Tears streamed down her face, but now they were tears of hope instead of despair. James reached the child and dropped to his knees beside the small body. His training kicked in immediately. He checked the boy's airway and breathing. The child was in severe distress. His airways were almost completely closed. Without immediate help, he would be dead in minutes. "What's his name?" James asked the mother as he began his assessment. "Danny," she said through her tears. "His name is Danny. He's 8 years old. He has asthma, but it's never been this bad before." James nodded and focused on the child. Danny's pulse was fast and weak. His skin was cold and clammy. His breathing was so labored that each breath was a struggle. But he was still alive. James had made it in time. As James began emergency treatment, he knew his life was over. By the time he helped this child, his career would be finished. His reputation would be destroyed. His future would be gone. But looking at Danny's small face, James knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. But sometimes everything is a price worth paying. James knelt beside Danny and took control of the situation. The little boy was fighting for every breath. His mother watched with wide, frightened eyes. The crowd of tourists stood in a circle around them, but James blocked them out. All that mattered now was saving this child's life. "Danny, can you hear me?" James asked in a calm, gentle voice. The boy's eyes opened a little bit. They were scared and confused. "I'm here to help you, son. You're going to be okay." James had learned about asthma attacks during his medical training in the army. He knew that panic made everything worse. The child needed to stay calm, but that was hard when you could not breathe. James had to work fast and keep Danny from getting more scared. "Ma'am, does Danny have an inhaler?" James asked the mother. An inhaler was a small device that helped people with asthma breathe better. Most people with asthma carried one everywhere they went. The woman's face went white. Yes, but we lost it. It fell out of my purse somewhere. I've been looking everywhere for it. Her voice shook with guilt and fear. She felt like this was her fault. James nodded. He had hoped for an inhaler, but he had other ways to help. What's your name, ma'am? Linda, she said. Linda Morrison. We're visiting from Manchester. This is our first time in London. She started crying again. I should have been more careful with his inhaler. This is all my fault. This is not your fault, James said firmly. Accidents happen. Right now, we need to focus on helping Danny. James had seen many parents blame themselves during emergencies, but blame did not help anyone. James positioned Danny carefully. The boy needed to sit up a little bit to help his breathing. James had learned this technique during his army training. When airways were blocked, the right position could make a big difference. Danny, I need you to try to stay calm, James said softly. I know it's scary when you can't breathe well, but I'm going to help you. My name is James, and I'm a soldier. I help people who are hurt. The little boy tried to nod, but he was too weak. His breathing was still very bad. Each breath sounded like a whistle. James could hear the airways fighting to let air through. James began using a technique called rescue breathing. He helped Danny breathe in a slow, controlled way. Breathe with me, Danny, in slowly through your nose, good. Now out slowly through your mouth, like you're blowing out birthday candles. This was hard for Danny, but James was patient. He counted the breaths and helped the boy find a rhythm. In 2, 3, 4. Out 2, 3, 4. James repeated this over and over. Linda watched everything James did. How do you know how to do this? She asked. I'm a soldier, James explained while he worked. All soldiers learn medical training. We have to know how to help hurt people. James did not mention that he was about to lose his job for helping her son. The crowd around them was getting bigger. More tourists stopped to watch. Some people were taking pictures and videos with their phones. James tried to ignore them, but he knew these images would be seen all over the world very soon. Can everyone please step back? James called to the crowd. Give us some space so Danny can breathe better. Most people moved back, but they kept watching. James understood their curiosity, but Danny needed privacy and calm. James checked his watch. It had been 5 minutes since he left his post. The ambulance should arrive soon, but Danny could not wait much longer. The boy's breathing was still very labored and his color was not getting better. James tried another technique. He helped Danny lean forward and rest his arms on his knees. This position sometimes helped people with breathing problems. Try this, Danny. Sometimes this makes it easier. The new position helped a little bit. Danny's breathing became slightly less strained. James felt a small spark of hope. The boy was fighting hard and James was not going to give up on him. That's good, Danny, James said encouragingly. You're doing great. Keep breathing with me, and slowly out slowly. James kept his voice calm and confident even though he was very worried inside. Linda held her son's hand. You're so brave, baby, she whispered. Mommy's here. The nice soldier is helping you. Her voice was still shaky, but she was trying to be strong for Danny. James looked around for any sign of the ambulance. London traffic could be terrible, and emergency vehicles sometimes got stuck. But this was taking too long. Danny needed professional medical help, and James was running out of things he could do. Ma'am, did you call for an ambulance? James asked Linda. Yes, about 10 minutes ago. Maybe 15. I don't know exactly. Everything happened so fast. Linda looked around desperately. Where are they? Why is it taking so long? James knew that ambulances in central London usually arrived within 8 to 10 minutes. But sometimes there were delays. Car accidents, busy traffic, or multiple emergencies could slow them down. Every minute felt like an hour when a child's life was at stake. Danny's breathing was still very difficult, but it was not getting worse. James took this as a good sign. The boy was stable for now, but he needed real medical equipment. He needed oxygen and proper asthma medication. Danny, you're being very brave, James told the boy. Help is coming soon. The ambulance will have special medicine to make you feel better. James hoped this was true. He hoped the ambulance would arrive before Danny got worse again. James continued the breathing exercises with Danny. The repetition was helping both of them stay calm. James counted breaths and watched the boy's color. Slowly, very slowly, Danny seemed to be getting a tiny bit better. Is he going to be okay? Linda asked quietly. James looked at her honestly. He's stable right now. The ambulance should be here soon and they'll have everything he needs. James did not make promises he could not keep, but he tried to give Linda hope. In the distance, James finally heard the sound he had been waiting for. Sirens. The ambulance was coming. James felt relief wash over him. Professional help was almost here. Do you hear that, Danny? James said with a smile. The ambulance is coming. They have special doctors who know exactly how to help you breathe better. Danny managed a small nod. His breathing was still hard, but he was holding on. James had kept him alive until help could arrive. That was all he could do, and it might be enough. The sirens got louder. James could see flashing lights in the distance. In a few more minutes, Danny would get the medical care he needed. James had done his job. He had saved a child's life. But as the ambulance got closer, James also knew that his real problems were just beginning. The ambulance arrived with flashing lights and loud sirens. 2 paramedics jumped out and ran toward James and Danny. James felt a huge wave of relief. Professional help was finally here. The little boy would get the medical care he needed. What do we have here? Asked the first paramedic, a woman with short blonde hair. She knelt down next to Danny and immediately began checking his vital signs. 8-year-old boy, severe asthma attack, James reported like the soldier he was. Started about 15 minutes ago. No inhaler available. Airway severely restricted. Breathing is labored but stable. The paramedic looked surprised to hear such a professional report from someone in a Royal Guard uniform. Are you medically trained? She asked. Army medic training, James replied. I've been helping him with breathing exercises and positioning. The second paramedic, a tall man with dark hair, was already unpacking equipment from their ambulance. He brought over an oxygen mask and other medical devices. Good work keeping him stable, he told James. We'll take it from here. James moved back to give the paramedics room to work. They put an oxygen mask over Danny's face and gave him breathing treatments through a special machine. Within minutes, the boy's breathing began to improve. His color started to look better. The medicine was working. Linda Morrison watched everything with tears of relief streaming down her face. Is he going to be okay? She asked the paramedics. He's responding well to treatment, the female paramedic said. We need to take him to the hospital for observation, but his breathing is definitely improving. Danny's eyes were more alert now. The oxygen and medicine were helping him feel better. He looked around and saw James standing nearby. The little boy tried to speak, but the oxygen mask made it hard. Don't try to talk right now, sweetheart, the paramedic told Danny. Just focus on breathing. You're doing great. The paramedics prepared to move Danny to the ambulance. They put him on a stretcher and made sure he was comfortable and safe. Linda gathered her purse and prepared to go with her son to the hospital. Before they left, Linda walked over to James. She was still crying, but now her tears were happy ones. Thank you, she said, her voice full of emotion. You saved my boy's life. I don't know how to thank you enough. James felt uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what anyone would do, he said quietly. No, Linda said firmly. Not anyone would do what you did. You gave up everything to help a stranger's child. You left your post. You broke your rules. You risked your job to save Danny. She took James's hands in hers. You're a hero. The word hero made James feel strange. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had made an impossible choice and would soon pay a terrible price for it. As the ambulance drove away with Danny and his mother, James became aware of the crowd around him. Hundreds of people had gathered to watch the drama unfold. Many of them were holding up phones and cameras. They had recorded everything. That was incredible, shouted one tourist. I can't believe a Royal Guard actually moved. Did you get it on video? Asked another person. This is going to be all over the internet. He saved that kid's life, called out a third voice. What a hero. The crowd began to clap and cheer. They surrounded James, patting him on the back and congratulating him. But James did not feel like celebrating. He knew what was coming next. James looked back toward the palace gates. The other royal guards were still standing at their posts, but he could see the shock and worry on their faces. Robert looked especially concerned. They all knew that James had just committed the most serious crime a royal guard could commit. A police officer approached James through the crowd. Sir, I need to speak with you, the officer said politely but firmly. James nodded. He knew this was standard procedure. When a royal guard left his post, the police had to investigate. James would have to explain his actions and face the consequences. "I understand," James said. "I'm ready to answer your questions." Before the police officer could say anything else, a black military vehicle pulled up to the scene. James recognized it immediately. It was from his regiment. His commanding officers were coming to deal with the situation personally. Colonel Harrison stepped out of the vehicle. He was James's direct superior and a man James had always respected, but the colonel's face was dark with anger and disappointment. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said in a cold voice, "you will come with me immediately." "Yes, sir," James replied. He had expected this. Military discipline was swift and severe. As James walked toward the military vehicle, the crowd of tourists realized what was happening. "Wait," someone called out. "He's a hero. He saved a child's life. You can't punish him for helping someone," shouted another person, but James knew better. The military did not care about public opinion. Rules were rules, and he had broken the most important rule of all. Before getting into the vehicle, James took one last look at his post near the palace gates. His rifle was still there, abandoned where he had left it. His tall black hat was still lying on the ground where it had fallen when he ran to help Danny. Those items represented 12 years of his life. 12 years of perfect service. 12 years of following orders and never making a mistake. All of that was over now. The crowd continued to cheer and call James a hero as the military vehicle drove away. People took more pictures and videos. Within hours, the story would be on television news programs around the world. But James sat in the back of the vehicle knowing that the real story was just beginning. Saving Danny's life was the easy part. Now came the hard part, facing the consequences of his choice. Colonel Harrison sat across from James in silence. The colonel's disappointment was obvious. He did not need to say anything. James knew he had let down his regiment, his fellow guards, and the entire royal military tradition. As they drove through the streets of London, James thought about Danny Morrison. The little boy was probably at the hospital now, breathing easily with proper medical care. His mother was probably holding his hand and telling him how brave he had been. James was glad he had saved the boy. Even knowing what was coming, he did not regret his choice. Some things were more important than rules. Some things were more important than careers. A child's life was one of those things. But James also knew that good intentions would not save him from military justice. The system did not care why he had broken the rules. It only cared that he had broken them. The vehicle pulled up to military headquarters. James's real punishment was about to begin. The military headquarters building was cold and gray. James had been there many times before for meetings and training sessions. But this time felt different. This time he was not walking in as a respected sergeant. He was walking in as a soldier who had broken the most sacred rule of his service. Colonel Harrison led James down a long hallway, lined with pictures of famous military leaders. Their painted eyes seemed to stare down at James with disappointment. These men had built their careers on discipline and following orders. James had thrown all of that away in a single moment. They stopped outside a heavy wooden door with a brass nameplate that read, "Military Justice Office." James had never been inside this room before. Good soldiers never needed to visit this office. Only soldiers who had done something wrong came here. "Wait here," Colonel Harrison said. He knocked on the door and went inside. James could hear voices talking, but he could not make out the words. After a few minutes, the colonel came back out. "They're ready for you," Colonel Harrison said. His voice was professional, but James could hear the sadness underneath. The colonel had liked James. He had been proud of James's service record. Now he had to watch a good soldier destroy his own career. James walked into the office and stood at attention. Behind a large wooden desk sat 3 senior officers. In the middle was General Thompson, the highest-ranking officer in the Royal Guard Regiment. To his left sat Colonel Davis from military personnel. To his right sat Major Wilson from military law. "Sergeant Mitchell," General Thompson said in a stern voice. "Do you understand why you are here?" "Yes, sir," James replied. "I abandoned my post while on guard duty." "That is correct," the general said. "This is the most serious offense a Royal Guard can commit. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" James thought about his answer carefully. He could explain about the dying child. He could talk about saving a life. He could mention his duty as a human being. But he knew these officers did not want to hear excuses. They wanted facts. "No excuse, sir," James said. "I left my post without permission." General Thompson nodded. "At least you are honest about what you did. That shows some character." The general picked up a file from his desk. "Sergeant Mitchell, your service record is exemplary. 12 years without a single disciplinary action. Perfect attendance. Outstanding performance reviews. You have been a model soldier." James felt a small spark of hope. Maybe his good record would help him. Maybe they would give him a second chance. But General Thompson's next words crushed that hope. "However, none of that matters now. You have committed the ultimate betrayal of your oath as a royal guard. The Queen's security depends on guards who never leave their posts. Never. Not for any reason." Colonel Davis opened another file. The incident was witnessed by hundreds of people. It was filmed by dozens of cameras. The whole world has seen a royal guard abandon his duty. This creates a security risk for the entire royal family. James had not thought about that. If other people saw that royal guards would leave their posts, it might encourage attacks on the royal family. Bad people might think the guards were not reliable. James's actions had consequences beyond just himself. Major Wilson spoke next. "We have already been contacted by news organizations from around the world. Social media is calling you a hero. But we cannot have royal guards making individual decisions about when to follow orders and when to ignore them." James understood their position. Military discipline was based on following orders without question. If every soldier decided for himself which orders to follow, there would be chaos. The system only worked if everyone followed the rules. "We have no choice but to begin court-martial proceedings against you," General Thompson announced. "You will be charged with abandonment of duty, dereliction of post, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." James felt his heart sink. A court-martial was a military trial. If he was found guilty, he could face prison time. He would definitely lose his job and his pension. His military career would be over forever. "You have the right to legal representation," Colonel Davis explained. "The military will provide a lawyer, or you can hire your own. The trial will begin in 2 weeks." James nodded. He had expected this, but hearing it officially made it real. His life as he knew it was over. "Until the trial, you are suspended from all duties," Major Wilson added. "You will surrender your uniform, weapons, and identification. You are not allowed on any military property except for court proceedings." This was the part James had been dreading. For 12 years, his red uniform had been his identity. Taking it off would be like losing a part of himself. "Sir, may I ask about my family's housing?" James said quietly. Military families lived in special housing provided by the Army. If James lost his job, his wife and children would lose their home too. "You have 30 days to find alternative housing," General Thompson replied. "After that, military housing is no longer available to you." James felt sick. Sarah and the children would have to leave their home. Tommy would have to change schools. Emma would lose her friends. His choices were affecting everyone he loved. The meeting continued for another hour. The officers explained the legal process and James's rights. They discussed the evidence against him and the likely outcomes. Everything they said made James's situation sound worse and worse. Finally, General Thompson stood up. "Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to understand something. Personally, I admire what you did. As a father, I would want someone to help my child the same way. But as a military officer, I cannot allow this behavior to go unpunished." James appreciated the general's honesty. These men were not evil. They were just doing their jobs. The military system required harsh punishment for serious offenses. It was nothing personal. "You may go now," the general said. "Report to the equipment office to surrender your gear. A lawyer will contact you within 48 hours to discuss your defense." James saluted one last time as a serving soldier. "Thank you, sir." As James left the office, he thought about Danny Morrison. The little boy was probably at home now, playing with his toys and breathing easily. His mother was probably making him his favorite dinner and thanking God that her son was alive. James had given up everything to save that child. His career, his income, his home, his future. But looking back, he knew he would make the same choice again. Some things were worth any price. The equipment office was in the basement of the building. James had been there many times to get new gear or repair old equipment. But this time he was there to give everything back. Sergeant Roberts was working behind the counter. He looked uncomfortable when he saw James. News of the incident had already spread through the entire regiment. "I'm sorry about this, James," Sergeant Roberts said quietly. "We all heard what happened. What you did was brave." "Thank you," James replied. "But brave or not, I still broke the rules." James placed his red coat on the counter, then his black pants, his polished boots, his tall black hat, his white gloves, his ceremonial sword. Each item represented years of pride and tradition. Last, he placed his rifle on the counter. This was the hardest part. A soldier's weapon was sacred. Giving it up meant he was no longer a warrior. Sergeant Roberts filled out paperwork for each item. "Your civilian clothes are in the locker room," he said. "You can change in there." James walked to the locker room and put on his regular clothes. Jeans and a sweater. Normal clothes for a normal man. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Without his uniform, he looked like any other person on the street. As James walked out of the military building for the last time as a soldier, he knew his old life was over. Tomorrow, he would have to tell Sarah and the children what had happened. He would have to explain why Daddy was not a Royal Guard anymore. But tonight, somewhere in London, a little boy named Danny Morrison was alive and healthy because James Mitchell had chosen to be human instead of just a soldier. The courtroom was cold and formal. James sat at a wooden table next to his military lawyer, Captain Peters. Across from them sat the prosecution lawyers who would try to prove James was guilty. Behind them, the three judges who would decide his fate sat in tall black chairs. 2 weeks had passed since James saved Danny Morrison's life. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and worried conversations with Sarah. 2 weeks of watching the news coverage and reading the comments from people around the world. Some called him a hero. Others said he was a traitor to his uniform. But none of that mattered now. In this courtroom, only military law mattered. Only rules and regulations and the chain of command. James's fate would be decided by 3 officers who had spent their entire careers following orders without question. "All rise for the honorable court," called the bailiff. Everyone in the courtroom stood up as the 3 judges entered. The head judge was Colonel Matthews, a stern woman with gray hair and cold eyes. James had heard she was known for harsh sentences. "Please be seated," Colonel Matthews said. "This court-martial is now in session. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Sergeant James Mitchell on charges of abandonment of duty, dereliction of post, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." The prosecution lawyer stood up first. Major Stevens was a tall man with a sharp voice. "Your Honor, this case is simple. Sergeant Mitchell abandoned his post while on guard duty. There were hundreds of witnesses. There is video evidence. The defendant does not deny what he did." Major Stevens walked around the courtroom as he spoke. "The defense will try to make you feel sorry for Sergeant Mitchell. They will talk about the sick child he helped. They will say he had good intentions. But intentions do not matter in military law. Only actions matter." James felt his stomach tighten as Major Stevens continued. "If we excuse this behavior, what happens next? Do guards leave their posts whenever they hear a car accident? Do they abandon the Queen's security to help lost tourists? Where does it end?" The prosecutor showed pictures of James running from his post. "Look at these images. This is a Royal Guard abandoning his duty. This is a soldier putting his personal feelings above his sworn oath. This cannot be tolerated." When Major Stevens finished, Captain Peters stood up to defend James. "Your Honor, my client is a good man who made a difficult choice in an impossible situation. He saw a child dying and knew he had the skills to help. What kind of person would he be if he just stood there and watched?" Captain Peters was younger than the prosecutor and seemed nervous. "Sergeant Mitchell has served with distinction for 12 years. He has never broken a rule or disobeyed an order. This was not the action of a bad soldier. This was the action of a good man." But James could see that the judges were not impressed. Their faces showed no emotion. They had heard these arguments before. Military courts did not care about good intentions or difficult choices. The trial continued for 3 days. Witness after witness testified about what they had seen. The other Royal Guards were called to testify. Robert took the stand and tried to help James, but he had to admit that James had broken the rules. "Did Sergeant Mitchell have permission to leave his post?" Major Stevens asked Robert. "No, sir," Robert replied quietly. "Was there any emergency protocol that allowed him to abandon his position?" "No, sir." "So he simply decided on his own to ignore his orders and leave his post?" Robert looked at James with sad eyes. "Yes, sir. But he saved a child's life." "That was not the question," Major Stevens said coldly. He broke military law. That is all this court needs to know. The prosecution also called Colonel Harrison to testify. James's former commanding officer looked uncomfortable as he answered questions about military discipline and the importance of following orders. Colonel Harrison, what would happen if every soldier decided for himself when to follow orders? Major Stevens asked. Military discipline would collapse, Colonel Harrison admitted. The chain of command only works if orders are followed without question. And what is the standard punishment for abandoning one's post? Dismissal from service and forfeiture of all benefits, Colonel Harrison said quietly. When it was the defense's turn, Captain Peters called character witnesses to testify about James's good service record. Fellow soldiers talked about James's dedication and professionalism. His former commanding officers praised his reliability and skill. Linda Morrison, Danny's mother, was called to testify. She broke down crying as she described watching her son nearly die. Sergeant Mitchell saved my boy's life, she said through her tears. Danny would be dead if this brave man had not helped us. The prosecution objected. Your Honor, while we sympathize with Mrs. Morrison, the outcome does not change the fact that military law was broken. Colonel Matthews agreed. The witness's gratitude is noted, but this court must focus on military regulations, not civilian emotions. On the final day, James was allowed to speak in his own defense. He stood up and faced the three judges who would decide his future. Your Honor, I do not deny what I did, James said clearly. I left my post without permission. I broke my oath as a Royal Guard. I understand that my actions have consequences. James paused and looked at each judge. But I would do it again. I could not stand there and watch a child die when I had the power to help. My training taught me to protect people, not to ignore them when they need help. I have served the Queen and my country for 12 years. I have never asked for special treatment or made excuses for my actions. I am not asking for mercy now. I am only asking you to remember that soldiers are human beings first, and human beings help children in trouble. When James sat down, the courtroom was quiet. Even Major Stevens looked uncomfortable. But James knew his words would not change anything. Military law was clear, and he had broken it. The judges left the courtroom to make their decision. James waited with Captain Peters for 2 hours. Sarah sat in the back of the courtroom with tears in her eyes. She knew what was coming. When the judges returned, Colonel Matthews stood up to read the verdict. Sergeant James Mitchell, this court finds you guilty on all charges. You willfully abandoned your post, derelicted your duty, and brought disrepute to the Royal Guard Regiment. James stood at attention as his fate was announced. You are hereby dismissed from military service with a dishonorable discharge. You forfeit all rank, pay, and benefits. You are banned from all military installations and events. The words hit James like physical blows. Dishonorable discharge meant he would never work in security or law enforcement again. No benefits meant his family would lose their medical insurance and his pension. No rank meant 12 years of service counted for nothing. Furthermore, Colonel Matthews continued, you forfeit any claim to military housing. You have 15 days to vacate your quarters. James felt the world spinning around him. He had expected punishment, but this was worse than he had imagined. They were taking everything. His career, his income, his home, his future, all for saving a child's life. As the court was dismissed, James turned to look at Sarah. She was crying but trying to be strong. They would face this together, but it would not be easy. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Sergeant Mitchell, how do you feel about the verdict? They shouted. James walked past them without speaking. What was there to say? He had saved a life and lost everything else. The price of heroism was higher than anyone should have to pay. But as James walked away from the courthouse, he thought about Danny Morrison. The little boy was alive and healthy, playing with his friends and going to school. That was worth any price, even this one. 5 years later, James Mitchell stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his small apartment. The face looking back at him was older and more tired than it should have been. Gray hair was starting to show at his temples. Lines of worry marked his forehead. This was not how he had imagined his life would look at 39 years old. James put on his security guard uniform and checked his appearance. The uniform was navy blue instead of royal red. The badge said Westfield Shopping Center instead of Royal Guard. The job paid £12 an hour instead of a sergeant's salary. Everything about his life had become smaller and cheaper. The apartment was tiny compared to the military housing where his family used to live. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and a small kitchen. James slept on a fold-out couch in the living room. The walls were thin, and he could hear his neighbors arguing and watching television at all hours. James looked at the photograph on his small table. It showed Sarah and the children from happier times. Tommy was now 13 and had grown tall like his father. Emma was 10 and looked more like her mother every year. But James only saw them every other weekend now, when he could afford the train ticket to their new town. Sarah had tried to make their marriage work after the court-martial. For 2 years, she had supported James while he looked for work and struggled with depression. But the financial pressure and emotional stress had been too much. The divorce papers had been signed 6 months ago. James ate a quick breakfast of instant coffee and toast. Real food was expensive, and James had to be careful with every penny. His monthly rent took most of his income. The rest went to child support payments and basic necessities. There was never anything left over for luxuries or emergencies. The bus ride to work took 45 minutes through busy London traffic. James watched the city wake up around him. Business people in expensive suits talked on their phones. Students hurried to university classes. Families pushed baby strollers through the parks. Everyone else seemed to have somewhere important to go and something meaningful to do. James arrived at the shopping center and checked in with his supervisor, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Robinson was a decent man who treated James fairly, but he did not understand why an ex-soldier would take such a low-paying job. "Morning, James," Mr. Robinson said. "You're on the main floor today. Watch for shoplifters and help anyone who looks lost." James nodded and took his position near the entrance. His job was simple but boring. He walked around the shopping center for 8 hours, watching for trouble and answering questions from customers. It was nothing like the pride and purpose he had felt as a royal guard. The morning passed slowly. James helped an elderly woman find the pharmacy. He gave directions to a lost tourist. He watched teenagers who might be thinking about stealing something. The work was easy but meaningless. Anyone could do this job. There was nothing special about it. During his lunch break, James sat alone in the food court and ate a sandwich he had brought from home. Around him, families enjoyed meals together and friends laughed about their plans. James felt invisible and forgotten. A television in the food court was showing the news. James looked up when he heard a familiar name. Danny Morrison, now 13 years old, was honored today by the London Emergency Services for his work raising money for asthma research. James watched as a healthy, smiling teenager shook hands with important officials. Danny had grown into a confident young man who was using his experience to help other children with asthma. His mother Linda stood beside him, proud and happy. Danny nearly died from an asthma attack 5 years ago, the news reporter explained. He was saved by the quick actions of a royal guard who left his post to help. Since then, Danny has dedicated himself to helping other children with breathing problems. James felt a mix of pride and sadness watching the news. Danny was alive and thriving. The choice James had made was still paying off in ways he had never imagined. But James himself had been forgotten by everyone except his own broken family. The afternoon at work was just as boring as the morning. James walked his rounds and tried not to think about what his life used to be like. He tried not to remember the pride of wearing the royal uniform or the respect people showed him when he was a sergeant. Sometimes James wondered what would have happened if he had stayed at his post that day. Danny Morrison would have died, but James would still have his career and his family. He would still be respected and important. His children would still live with him. His marriage would still be intact, but whenever James thought this way, he felt ashamed. How could he wish a child had died just so his own life would be easier? That was not the kind of man he wanted to be. That was not the kind of father he wanted his children to remember. At the end of his shift, James took the long bus ride home. The apartment felt cold and empty when he walked in. There were no children's voices calling "Daddy's home." There was no wife asking about his day. There was just silence and the sound of traffic outside his window. James heated up a frozen dinner and ate it while watching television. The programs were loud and silly, designed to help people forget their problems for a while. But James's problems were always there, waiting for him when the shows ended. He called Tommy and Emma every night at 8 o'clock. They were always excited to hear from him, but the conversations were short. What could a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old say to a father who lived far away and worked at a shopping mall? "Hi, Dad," Tommy said when he answered the phone. "How was work?" "Fine, son." "How was school?" "Good. I scored 2 goals in football practice today." James felt proud but also sad that he had not been there to watch. "That's wonderful, Tommy. I'm very proud of you." Emma got on the phone next. "Daddy, when are you coming to visit?" "Next weekend, sweetheart. We'll go to the park and get ice cream." "Okay, I miss you." "Daddy, I miss you too, Emma. More than you know." After the phone call, James sat in his small living room and thought about the choices that had led him here. 5 years ago, he had been a respected soldier with a bright future. Now he was a lonely security guard living paycheck to paycheck. But somewhere in London, Danny Morrison was healthy and happy. The boy James had saved was now becoming a young man who helped other children. Danny's mother still had her son. Danny's friends had their friend. Danny's future was still possible because of what James had done. James looked at himself in the mirror one more time before going to bed. The face was older and more tired, but it was not the face of a man who regretted his choices. It was the face of a man who had paid a terrible price for doing the right thing. Some people said James was a hero. Others said he was a fool. But James knew the truth. He was just a man who had chosen to save a child's life when he had the chance. The cost had been higher than he ever imagined, but the choice had been right. As James fell asleep on his fold-out couch, he whispered a prayer of thanks that Danny Morrison was alive and well. Whatever price James had paid, whatever he had lost, it was worth it for that one simple fact. A child lived because a man had chosen humanity over duty. In the end, that was enough.